Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I will be using the Gina K Stamps Bunches of Love stamp set to do a little bit of watercoloring. I have some watercolor paper, some Versaclear Nocturne Black ink, some clear embossing powder, my Winsor Newton watercolors, and I'm using the two brush method. So one for putting down water, one for moving the pigment around. When I get done watercoloring, I will use some Honeybee dye decal edge dies, or Honeybee Stamps decal edge dies, and an old Stampin' Up! Embossing folder to kind of create the front of my card. I think that's all there is about the coloring, so let's go ahead and jump on into our crime. So our alphabetical journey today takes us way back to the late 1700s and the beginning of the state of Kentucky. By the 1780s, the survival of the Kentucky settlements was uncertain. The population was meager, mostly due to conflicts with Native American tribes who had great support from Great Britain. At the end of the American Revolution, however, the British curtailed their support for these raids, and thousands of American settlers sought better life in the, quote, Eden of the West. That was what they were calling this part of the country. So they swarmed through the Cumberland Gap and down the Ohio River, and they cleared the land for crops, they established towns, and eventually the division of sprawling Kentucky County became, it needed to be 3 counties. It got so big it could not be one county. So by 1780, the rate of growth had accelerated so fast that by the end of the next decade, or the beginning of the next decade rather, it was evident that the state of Kentucky needed to be established. At this point in time, at the late 1780s, it was still part of the state of Virginia. So on June 1st, 1792, Kentucky did become the 15th state in the new nation and the first state west of the Allegheny Mountains. Now, Kentucky is home to more than 130 caves. The most famous, of course, is Mammoth Cave, which has more than 400 subterranean miles and is the longest cave system in the world. The state of Kentucky once owned the Ohio River. In 1792, the federal government determined that Kentucky could own the river. While bourbon and bluegrass go hand in hand, Ale 8-1 is actually the official drink of the state of Kentucky. And speaking of drinks, there are 120,000 mint juleps served every year at the Kentucky Derby. Corbin, Kentucky is home to the Sanders Cafe, and in the 1850s, the Colonel identified the potential of restaurant franchising. And in 1952, the very first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise was opened in Salt Lake City, Utah. And speaking of food, Kalen's restaurant in Louisville, Kentucky claims to have invented the cheeseburger in 1934. In Kentucky, you can find a 3-mile-wide crater caused by a meteor crash over 300 years ago. This crater isn't just a hole in the middle of the state, it is actually the site of Middlesboro, the only town constructed inside the meteor crater. Kentucky is also the birthplace of the Happy Birthday song. The song may feel like it's been around forever and ever, but it was actually written by 2 sisters who claim to have written it for the song to sing to the children that they taught. And Kentucky is where a Harrod disappeared. Now, like I said, we're going way back today, back before Kentucky was even a state. James Harrod was born in Bedford County, province of Pennsylvania, then a British royal colony, now Bedford County, Pennsylvania, and he was one of 12 children born to John and Sarah Harrod. His birth date and the actual birth of his year is disputed. His date is not known, and his year is disputed. In 1760, he volunteered as one of Captain Cochrane's recruits, and he told them he was 16 years old. However, he was 5 feet 2 inches tall. And that is a huge difference between his adult height of over 6 feet. This led most historians to believe that he lied about his age in order to enlist, probably being more like 14 instead of 16. Sources list his birth year as anywhere from 1742 to 1746, and most think that it was probably 1742. Now, James grew up a frontiersman and was particularly adept at hunting, trapping, and fishing. His skill with a rifle was particularly noteworthy. And why would a 14-year-old boy with such awesome skills in taking care of himself want to join a military at 14 years old? Well, it's about the same time that his father's first wife, so his mother, and his brother Sam were killed in an Indian raid. So kind of his life, it was not without hardship and trial. In 1754, near the beginning of the French and Indian War, James's father was also killed. So his father had remarried, and the second wife relocated the family to Fort Littleton, and James served there as a ranger and a guard. James and another of his brothers, William, then served under John Forbes during the French and Indian War. And despite his experiences with the Native American tribes, he never developed a hatred or hard feelings toward them. In fact, he had the reputation of being really generous, using his hunting skills to provide food for those who could not provide for themselves, including Native Americans. Early sources record that James was illiterate, except that he also was known to have a record of written records and books in his home. So I don't know, that seems contrary. If he had books and he wrote records, he probably was literate. But whatever. As an adult, James was described as a larger than average man, again being over 6 feet tall, with very good features, a good, strong, sturdy build, black hair, and a black beard. And he was described as a natural leader, but a good leader. Like, people naturally wanted to follow him because he was good. He was good. In 1763, James then joined Henry Bouquet in his relief of Fort Pitt during the Pontiac's Rebellion. This is all, the French-Indian War kind of thing. Later, he went exploring, and he ended up in what became Illinois. And while he was there, he lived among French traders and learned to speak French. He also spent time with the Native Americans in the area and learned to speak those tribal languages as well. So again, how illiterate could he have been if he was able to communicate in more than one language? Just saying. Now, in 1774, James was ordered by Lord Dunmore to lead an expedition to survey the bounds of the land that had been promised by the British Crown to anybody who served in the French-Indian War. So he left from Fort Redstone with 37 other men, and they traveled down the Monongahela and the Ohio rivers to the mouth of the Kentucky River. They eventually crossed the Salt River and landed in what is now Mercer County, Kentucky. On June 16th of 1774, James and the men established the first pioneer settlement in Kentucky, and they named it Harrodstown. The men then divided the land up amongst them, and James chose an area 6 miles or so away from the settlement proper, and he named it Boiling Springs. Just as James' men had completed the settlement's first structures, like the fort fence and the things that they needed to become an incorporated place, Lord Dunmore again dispatched Daniel Boone to call them back from the frontier and to call them back into active military service again against the Native Americans again. We're still talking the French-Indian War here. Now, James enlisted in the militia, but he actually got there too late. The war's only major battle, the Battle of Point Pleasure, occurred on October 10th, and James and his men got there at midnight, the very end of the only day of fighting. So fast forward a little bit, on March 8th of 1775, James led a group of settlers back to Harrodstown to stay. His intent was to just stay. He had found his place, this is where he wanted to be, and he was putting down roots. Within months, the town grew, and the original structures and fortifications became inadequate. They needed a bigger fort wall to protect them. They needed a bigger store, all the bigger things, right? They needed more. So the new structures were then built on top of Old Fort Hill, and that today is the site of Old Fort Harrod State Park. So it still is around. The settlers at Harrodstown joined other pioneers in the area at Boonesboro, Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone and James Harrod were contemporaries. They were friends. They served in the militias together. And Daniel Boone had settled not too far away. So the settlers from Harrodstown and the settlers from Boonesboro, and they actually got together to create the first governing regulations of the area. In 1778, James married Anne Coburn MacDonald, widow of James MacDonald, at Logan Station, a settlement that was established by another fellow explorer, Benjamin Logan. Now, to most people, Anne seemed to be too cultured to fit into the rough environment as a pioneer settler, a frontier settler. She was dainty and beautiful and educated. She came to Harrodstown in 1776 with her first husband, also named James, who was killed by Indians in a raid. And later that same year, her father was also killed and scalped. So it was not a pretty time for settlers and Native American tribes to be trying to live together. James and Anne had one daughter named Margaret in September of 1785. But Anne also had a son from her previous marriage, whose name was also James. But he was captured by Indians in November of 1787 and burned at the stake. So this is a lot. Harrod lost his father, his mother, a brother. His wife lost a husband, a father, a son to raids between the Native Americans and the settlers. Now, another thing that James was particularly good at in his leadership was successfully opposing Richard Henderson's colonization scheme for the Kentucky area. This is, American Revolution time, and Kentucky was not about to become a British colony. It was going to be an American territory. James he was very well respected, and he held several positions of political leadership. And when Virginia created Kentucky County in 1776, Harrodstown was the designated county seat. In 1777, James became a justice in Kentucky County and then was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1779. So through the 1780s, he served as a trustee for the settlement that bore his name, Harrodstown. And in 1784, he attended the first of a series of meetings in Danville that eventually led to Kentucky's petition for statehood. So James Harrod was right up there getting Kentucky its governing rules, its regulations, and its statehood. James's political service was frequently interrupted by military necessity. So in 1776 and 1777, he led 2 expeditions eastward to get provisions for the fledgling forts of Kentucky. Like, they could not get material goods in, so he went and got them. He served in the militia and defended the settlement of Harrodstown from Indian raids through the summer of 1777. And beginning in the militia at the rank of captain, he eventually obtained the rank of colonel. In 1779, he was given the rank, or earned the rank of colonel. So he's got this leadership, this natural born ability to lead. He seems to be doing what he feels is good and right. He wants to live a life, and Harrodstown is growing, and James is becoming a wealthy farmer. He owned more than 20,000 acres across Kentucky, but he also was becoming more increasingly socially detached. And he started making these long, solitary excursions into the wilderness, like he just went to go be alone. He needed his downtime. In February of 1792, James and 2 other men entered the wilderness of Kentucky to hunt for beaver, and James never returned from the expedition. That's it. He never came back. This great man who did this great thing for the state and the area and was good to people, even people who by custom should have been his enemy, disappeared off the face of the earth. There are many, many theories that have been proposed as to the fate of James Harrod. First and foremost was that he was killed by Native Americans in a raid, or that he got ill on this camping trip and died in the wilderness. Okay. There were no reports of any of that happening. Other theories hinged on the idea that James abandoned his family and left to go explore other parts of the country. There was even a legal disposition from his sister. She claimed that James came to live with her following his disappearance in Kentucky, but nobody else ever saw him. Another theory was that James had previously been married in Pennsylvania before his pioneering days, and that he simply returned to his first family, except that I couldn't find any records of a marriage then. And he joined the militia when he was 14. I doubt he had a family in Pennsylvania. A third tradition holds true, and this one has a little bit of merit, but maybe not so much, is that 2 pioneers from Kentucky were being held captive by Indians near Detroit, Michigan, and they saw a man enter the Indian camp. They claimed that they recognized him and even addressed him as Colonel Harrod. And when they came back to Kentucky, the 2 men indicated that James had told them he intended to return to his family, but had not said when. Anne Harrod offered the men $1,000 in 1790-something, $1,000 to take her to the last place they saw him, and they declined, stating the trip was too dangerous. $1,000. That's money now. That was a lot of money then. So, about 50 years after James disappeared, there's a historian named Henry Wilson, and he claimed that James told him that he felt his wife Anne had become a little too intimate with some of the other men in town. And this Henry Wilson guy said another man corroborated that Anne was not always a loving wife. And then Henry told him that James said, "You will not see me here again." And that many years later, people saw James in the northwestern United States. Most historians have come to doubt Henry Wilson's account because some of the other stories he told about historical events also proved to be false. So he was not a good source of information, it turned out. But the biggest thing that makes that idea that Anne and James were having trouble is that just before he left on this beaver hunting trip, he made out a will. And he left everything to his beloved wife and daughter. Most of the people in town, except for this one historian 50 years after the fact, said that James loved, almost worshipped was the word they used, his wife. So yeah, just a little side note here. Anne married a 3rd time after James disappeared. But in 1804, that marriage was annulled because she hadn't proved that James was dead. He was still listed as living. And it was never really clear whether or not Anne had James following his disappearance, or if this 3rd marriage was just, or the annulment of this 3rd marriage by claiming that, that James had never been found dead was just a way to get out of an undesirable third marriage. Who knows? So, James' wife and daughter and son-in-law, so Anne and their daughter and their daughter's husband, actually have their own theory. They believe that James was killed on this beaver hunting trip. James had taken these long, these trips into the woods by himself and coming back, getting away from people. But on this particular trip, he went with a man named Bridges. And Anne said that James and his companions were not actually hunting beaver, but were searching for a silver mine that a man named Jonathan Swift had claimed to have discovered like years before. So Anne claimed that she warned her husband because Bridges and James had a dispute over some property a few years earlier, and she was worried that he was out to get James. So James was not worried, except he made out a will, and then he had another friend of his come with him on this trip, a man named Michael Stoner. Now, according to Michael, the group had camped in the Three Fork area of the Kentucky River, where James had previously found an abundance of beaver. And one morning, Michael was making breakfast, and James and Bridges were off checking their traps, when suddenly Bridges rushed back into camp, claiming he heard a gunshot from James's area. And when James did not come back, Bridges went to look for him. So Bridges then returns to camp and claims that he saw fresh signs of Indian activity in the woods and was sure that James must have been killed. Michael wanted to go looking for James, but Bridges insisted that it was way too dangerous, and eventually Michael acquiesced and did not go looking. But soon after that expedition, Bridges went to Lexington, where he sold some of the furs from his trips and some silver buttons engraved with the letter H at a local shop. Well, the shopkeeper sent the buttons to Anne, and Anne claimed they belonged to her husband. Now, later, while searching the area where James was last seen, a group of his friends found some bones in a cave, and the bones were still very tightly wrapped in sedge grass, and it appeared that they had been used to help put the body into the cave from some other area. Some of the friends in this group claimed that the bones were wearing James's shirt with no buttons, but others claimed that there was no shirt at all. Regardless of the shirt and the buttons, when this group of friends came back to town, Bridges was gone. He had completely left the area. So James' family claimed that Bridges' flight proved that James's friends had found his body in the cave, and that Bridges left out of fear that he would be implicated in James's death. So clearly it seems like James is gone, right? Like he's been killed, he's dead, he's gone. But when Anne applied for James's pension, she told the military he had died in a hunting accident and that his clothes had been found in a nearby river. Now, I'm going to go out and say that she needed the money and she was going to find a way to get that pension because, she full on lied to get his pension. But she's not married. She has no income. Theoretically, any property that would have been James's would have transitioned to maybe his daughter's husband, given that we're in the 1700s here. So it seems like maybe Anne needed money, so she was going to tell the pension office, my husband was killed in a hunting accident, because by all intents and purposes, that's what it appeared to be. And yes, we have evidence. But that evidence wasn't available when she was trying to get an annulment from her third husband. So I'm just saying, there is a lot in this story that is missing. Like, why did Michael not actually hear the gunshot or say he heard the gunshot? Okay. why was it okay for Bridges to go walking around looking through the here's my air quotes here, dangerous woods, but it wasn't safe enough for Michael to go do it? How did Bridges have buttons that looked like James's buttons to sell them in a shop in another town? And how did the shopkeeper know to send them to Anne? Like, there's a lot of details here that I need to know the answers to, that I could not find the answers to. But it comes down to James disappeared. Whether he left of his own will and just decided he was done peopling and left all of his wealth to his wife and his daughter, like it stated in his will, whether he was in fact attacked and killed in the woods in a raid, whether his friend or frenemy did him in over this land quarrel they had some years before, seems irrelevant, because this great man who helped found the state of Kentucky disappeared from off the face of the earth and was not heard from ever again by anybody who loved him, except his sister, who probably lied. So here's a drawing of James Harrod, what he was reportedly looked like. And there is actually a historical marker in Kentucky still, talking about where he disappeared and never came back from. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed our story. I have a couple of other videos here I think that you would like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Which theory is most plausible to you? Give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, and have a really great day.